Evening, YouTube family. Mr. Mark 60 here, better known as the marketing practitioner. And before we get started, I'd like to welcome everybody and thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to like the page. Hit the little bell on the side so that you get notifications when I put up new YouTube videos. Subscribe and remember to check out some of my online marketing, money-making tips and training, free training at the bottom of the video. Well, it looks like Trump's election not only hurt the poor, middle, and working class, but it hurt the very people who voted in droves, the very people that were his constituents. Turns out that there's a penalty not only for being black in America, but when you vote for a guy like Trump, there's also a penalty for being white. Take a look at this particular article from Forbs magazine. This is going to blow you away because I'm sure it will surprise most of you like it did me. It's called Unspeakable Realities Block Universal Health Coverage in America. Now, it not only talks about health care coverage, but it talks about something much, much deeper. And that's the hidden curiosity about how you would think that people would vote for their interest and not against their own interest. But we need to look again at what we understand people's interest to be. When we think people are voting against their own interest when they vote for people like Trump who cut social programs, you better take another look at what people are really interested in. Check this out. This is by Chris Ladd, and I thought it was a very interesting and telling portrait of middle white America. Election 2016 has prompted a wave of head scratching on the left. Counties Trump won by staggering margins will be among the hardest hit by the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. Millions of white voters who supported Donald Trump stand to lose their health care coverage just because they voted for him. Individual profiles of Trump voters feed this baffling narrative. A Washington Post story described the experience of Clyde Graham, a long unemployed coal worker who depends on the ACA for access to health care. He voted for Trump knowing it might cost him his health care coverage, out of his hope of capturing the great white unicorn. In other words, a new job in the mines. His stance is not unusual. There were a lot more who had this same kind of hope. So the question becomes, why are economically struggling blue-collar voters rejecting a party that offers to expand public safety net programs? The reality is that the bulk of needy white voters are not interested in the public safety net. They want to restore their access to an older safety net, one more generous, dignified, and stable than the public system. This gets really good. Check this out. The one most well-employed voters still enjoy. So if you happen to be well-employed, then maybe you fall in that line. Most of the people I know are not well-employed, if employed at all. But let's take a look at the people who are well-employed. And let's take a look at what it is that they're worried about losing. When it seems like people are voting against their interests, you have to probably take a look and understand their interest. We cannot begin to understand election 2016 until we acknowledge the power and reach of socialism for white people. Americans with good jobs live in a socialist welfare state more generous, more cushioned, and more expensive to the public than any in Europe. Like a European system, we pool our resources to share the burden of catastrophic expenses. But unlike European models, our approach doesn't cover everyone. Like most of my neighbors, this is a white woman speaking, I have a good job in the private sector. Ask my neighbors about the cost of the welfare programs they enjoy, and you'll be greeted by baffled stares. All that we have is earned, and we perceive no need for government support. Nevertheless, taxpayers fund our retirement savings, health insurance, primary, secondary, and advanced education, daycare, commuter costs, and even our mortgages at a staggering public cost. I'll bet you never thought about that. And you thought they were doing it all on their own. Not. Socialism for white people is all-enveloping. It's benevolent, it's invisible, and insulated by the nasty, deceptive notion that we have earned our benefits by our own hand. I used to think that too. My family's generous health insurance costs about $20,000 a year, she says, of which we only pay $4,000 in premiums. The rest is subsidized by taxpayers. You read that right. Like virtually everyone else on my block who isn't old enough for Medicare or employed by the government, my family is covered by private health insurance subsidized by taxpayers at a stupendous public cost. Your mind blown yet? Well over 90% of white households earning over the white median income of about $75,000 carried health insurance even before the Affordable Care Act. White socialism is nice if you can get it. Companies can deduct the cost of their employees' health insurance, while employees are not required to report that benefit as income. That results in roughly a $400 billion annual transfer of funds from state and federal treasury to insurers to provide coverage for the Americans least in need of assistance. This is one of the defining features of white socialism that you never hear about. The most generous benefits go to those who are best suited to provide for themselves. Those benefits are not limited to health care either. This woman says, when I buy a house for my family or a vacation home, the interest I pay on the mortgage is deductible up to $1 million of debt. That costs the Treasury $70 billion a year, about what we spend to fund the food stamp program. So we're not only funding the food stamp program with a lot of hollering, but we're funding people who least need the funding. We're funding people who are quite well off. And you hear them who are the most vocal about food stamp programs, and yet they're getting the same thing. We're all getting subsidized. Why don't you hear more about this? Because it's quiet, it's private, and it's sneaky. My private retirement savings are also tax deductible, diverting another $75 billion from government revenues. Other tax preferences carve out special treatment for child care expenses, college savings, commuter costs, your suburban tax credit, local taxes, and other exemptions. By funding government programs with tax credits and deductions rather than spending, we have created an enormous social safety net that grows even more generous as household incomes rise. It is important to note that you need not be wealthy to participate. All you need to gain access to socialism for white people is a good corporate or government job. That fact helps explain how this welfare system took shape 60 years ago, and why it was originally and still overwhelmingly white, and why white Rust Belt voters showed far more enthusiasm for Donald Trump than for Bernie Sanders. White voters are not interested in democratic socialism. They want to restore their access to a more generous and dignified program of white socialism. But you didn't know that. In the years after World War II, the Western democracies that had not already done so adopted universal social safety net programs. These included health care, retirement, and other benefits. President Truman introduced his plan for universal health coverage in 1945. It would have worked much like Social Security, imposing a tax to fund a universal insurance pool. His plan went nowhere. Instead, 9 years later, Congress laid the foundations of the social welfare system we enjoy today. They rejected Truman's idea of universal private coverage in favor of a program controlled by employers while publicly funded through tax breaks. This plan gave corporations new leverage in negotiating with unions, handing the companies a publicly financed benefit they could distribute at their discretion. No one stated their intention to create a social welfare program for white people, specifically white men, but they did need to. By handing control to employers at a time when virtually every good-paying job was reserved for white men, the program silently accomplished that goal. White socialism played a vital political role as blue-collar factory workers and executives all pooled their resources for mutual support and protection, binding them together culturally and politically. Higher income workers certainly benefited more, but almost all the benefits of this system, from health care to pensions, originally accrued to white families through their male breadwinners. Blue-collar or white-collar, their fates were largely united by their racial identity and employment status. Until the decades after the Civil Rights Act, very few women or minorities gained direct access to this system. Unsurprisingly, this was the era in which white attitudes about the social safety net and the Democratic Party began to pivot. Thanks to this silent racial legacy, socialism for white people retains its disproportionately white character, though that has weakened. Racial boundaries are now less explicit and more permeable. But still today, white families are twice as likely as African Americans to have access to private health insurance. 2/3 of white children are covered by private health insurance, while barely over 1/3 of black children enjoy this benefit. White socialism has had a stark impact on the rest of the social safety net, creating a two-tiered system. Visit a county hospital to witness an example. American socialism for everyone else is marked by crowded conditions, neglected facilities, professionalism compromised by political patronage, and long waits for care. Fall outside the comfortable bubble of white socialism and one faces a world of frightening indifference. When Democrats respond to job losses with an offer to expand the public safety net, blue-collar voters cringe and rebel. They are not remotely interested in sharing the public social safety net experienced by minority groups and the poorest white families. Meanwhile, well-employed and affluent voters, ensconced in their system of white socialism, leverage all the power at their disposal to block any dilution of their expensive public welfare benefits. Something has to break. We may one day recognize that we are all in it together and find ways to build a more stable, sensible welfare system. That will not happen unless we acknowledge the painful and sometimes embarrassing legacy that brought us to this place. Absent that reckoning, unspoken realities will continue to warp our political calculations, frustrating our best hopes and stunting our potential. Amazing. Well, there you have it. You have every right to scream, to cuss, and to be righteously indignant about what you just read and just heard. For years, the poor, the working class, most of us who don't have those high-paying jobs or government jobs have been vilified in the media, news, print, and video about how lazy, shiftless, irresponsible,
and how we need to get up off of our asses and get busy. Pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. And here, right in front of you, you have people who make great salaries still being subsidized and propped up with government tax-paid subsidies. You ought to be pissed, and you ought to be ready to learn more. I'm Mr. Mark 60, and I'll be back with another video on the impact and the cause and consequences of being black and poor in America. Until then, don't forget to subscribe, like the page, send me your comments, and don't forget to check out the links at the bottom. There's some free training there you might find quite valuable. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you in our next video. Peace and take care.